Not that kind of Christian here. I wanted to do something a bit different. So I'm going to read from a very, very old edition of a book. It's a very special book. It's an edition of J M Barrie's Peter Pan. It's called Peter Pan and Wendy. And this particular edition is retold by Mary Byron, with pictures by Mabel Lucy Atwell. Well, this was given to my wife, Sharon, when she would have been probably about 2 years old. The edition you see here was published in 1970. So she would have been about 2. She would have been living in Great Yarmouth. Let's begin with the first chapter. I'm just going to go and assume my seat. So, from J M Barrie's Peter Pan and Wendy. The family at number 14. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who was 2 years old. Her name was Mary Moira Angela Darling. She was always called Wendy for short. One day she was playing in the garden and she ran to her mother with some flowers she had picked. And she looked so sweet, just like a little flower herself, that Mrs. Darling said, "Oh, why can't you stay like this forever?" Then Wendy began to see that one didn't stay at 2 for the rest of one's life. Indeed, 2 is the very beginning of the end. The end is being grown up. Once you get to 21 or so, you can never be ungrown up again. But Mrs. Darling didn't tell this to Wendy, because between 2 and 21, there was lots of time for her to find out. Mrs. Darling was perfect. Just the sort of mother one would choose. Sweet as honey, with lovely eyes, and a mouth that looked like a kiss. It had got like that with kissing her children so often. There were 3 children: Wendy, John, Michael, and Mrs. Darling didn't know which she loved best. They were all pretty good, but Wendy was the best, because she tried to make herself as like her mother as she could be. It wasn't easy, of course, but still she tried. The 3 little darlings had a very nice nursery with lots of toys and picture books, also a night nursery with little beds in it, and they had a most uncommon kind of nurse. She was called Nana, like other nurses, but she really was a large Newfoundland dog. Her kennel was in the nursery, so that she could keep her eyes on the children all the time. She was rather prim and particular, and would have everything just so. But she was splendid at games, and she would join in the wildest of romps. In fact, she was a real treasure. She bathed and dressed all the children, saw they got up and went to bed in proper time. I tell you, she wouldn't stand any nonsense. She gave them their medicine when it was wanted, changed their pennies when they became too grubby, and took them to the kindergarten and back every day, carrying an umbrella, if it looked like rain. The only person at number 14, this was the Darling's house, was not so much, who did not care much for Nana, was Mr. Darling, the father of Wendy, John and Michael. He was faddy about what the neighbours thought. He thought they must think it's certainly extremely odd to have a dog for a nurse. So Nana was never allowed to appear in the drawing room, and if visitors came, she was shut up in the nursery while the door was opened by the tiny maid-servant, Lisa. Everybody knew that Mr. Darling was not the best of friends with Nana, but everybody pretended not to know. It was a pity he was so set against her. However, the children had other things to take up their minds. When the kindergarten part of the day was over and it wasn't time for the evening romps and dances, they talked to each other about the Neverland. One could go on doing that for hours. The Neverland was make-believe island, full of delightful places and interesting people. It's very hard to describe because an island of that sort changes about from day to day, according to how you want it to be. It might be all over fairies, dwarfs and goblins, or it might have giants in enchanted castles and princes, always the younger of the three, who go and attack them. Or it might have a robber's cave, tumbled down cottage where a witch makes magic. There could be pirates there too, all sorts of ships. That's where an island comes in so useful. And coral reefs, underground rivers. There's no end to the wonderful things in the Neverland. The most wonderful of all, though, is Peter Pan. Now, Mrs. Darling knew more or less about the Neverland. Very likely when she was little, she had a make-believe island of her own, crammed full of flowers, kisses, and fairy ladies. As time went on, she forgot all about it. She liked to hear what the children had to tell her. There was one thing, however, which puzzled her, and that was the name Peter Pan. Wendy had the most to say about him, but John and Michael mentioned him now and then. When Mrs. Darling asked, "But who is Peter Pan?" nobody could explain. Only Wendy said that he wasn't a grown-up person. He was just her size. Wendy was now about 9. Mrs. Darling thought perhaps he was some kind of boy at kindergarten. But one day, Wendy told her that Peter sometimes came in the night and sat on the end of her bed, playing on his pipes. No kindergarten boy would do that. Besides, he couldn't get into the house without somebody knowing. So Mrs. Darling said that Wendy was talking nonsense. Nobody could come into the house that night. Wendy replied that was not nonsense. Peter came in by the window, she said. You know those funny leaves that were on the floor today, by the window? You couldn't think what they were. Mrs. Darling suddenly picked up some of the queer, unknown leaves. She said, "What have these leaves got to do with Peter Pan?" "They're off his shoes," said Wendy. "Naughty boy, he won't wipe his shoes. He never does." "Why have you never told me all this before?" asked her mother. "I suppose I forgot," said Wendy. Mrs. Darling was very uneasy, and she searched all over the nursery to see if the naughty boy was hiding anywhere. She asked Mr. Darling if he had ever heard of a person called Peter Pan, but he said, "Oh dear me, it's some silly stuff that Nana's been putting into the children's heads. What do you expect, if you will, have a dog for a nurse?" She thought she would show him the leaves, but on second thoughts, she did not. The following evening, Mrs. Darling was sitting sewing at the nursery fire. Nana had gone out, so she herself had bathed the little ones and put them to bed. They dropped off to sleep while she sang to them. She lit their little 3 night lights, and everything was quiet as it could be. Presently it was so peaceful. They went to sleep too, and suddenly the night nursery window flew open by itself, and a lovely little boy dropped in. He was dressed in every colour. When he saw a grown-up sitting there, he was very much annoyed. Mrs. Darling, waking with a start, knew at once, though I can't say how she knew, that this must be Peter Pan. And that is the end of The Family at number 14, ending on page 13. Hope you enjoyed that, folks. Please pass it along.